There is a strange paradox in the history of American television. The woman who made the entire nation laugh for decades was also someone many colleagues once said was very difficult to work with behind the scenes. On screen, Lucille Ball was the very symbol of laughter. She was Lucy Ricardo in I Love Lucy, the clumsy wife who constantly sent audiences into fits of laughter with her chaotic misadventures. A joyful woman, a comedy legend, a familiar face in millions of American homes. But Hollywood knew another Lucille Ball, a woman of fierce ambition, a notorious perfectionist, someone who controlled every tiny detail on set, from lighting, camera angles to the precise timing of each punchline. Some who worked with her recalled that Lucille Ball could demand a scene be reshot dozens of times, simply because a comedic beat landed half a second too late. Behind the laughter on screen was a very different person, a woman who had to fight for every step of survival in a ruthless industry. And if one looks back at her life from the very beginning, it becomes clear that Lucille Ball's story did not begin under the stage lights. It began in a small town in New York, where a life-altering event occurred when she was still just a child. An event many believe shaped the person she would later become. Because behind every Hollywood legend, there is always another story. Jamestown, New York, 1911. Lucille Ball was born into an ordinary American family at the dawn of the 20th century. At the time, no one could have imagined that the brown-haired little girl would one day become the most familiar face on television. But her childhood soon turned in a very different direction. When Lucille was only 3 years old, her father died of typhoid fever. The death came suddenly. The family was thrown into immediate crisis. Her mother was forced to leave home in search of work, struggling to support 2 small children during a difficult economic period. Lucille and her younger brother had to live with relatives for several years. Different houses, different rules, a life that was constantly shifting. There was no stability, no sense of safety that a child normally needs. People who knew Lucille as a child later said she quickly learned how to fend for herself and protect herself. But there was one small detail in her memories that always caught the attention of biographers. Lucille once recalled that on the day her father died, a bird suddenly flew into the house. The bird panicked, beating its wings frantically against the walls and windows as it tried to find a way out. The frantic sound of wings pounding inside that small room terrified young Lucille. The image stayed with her so deeply that she later said she had feared birds for the rest of her life. It may sound like a very small detail, but many biographers believe that memory symbolized the feeling Lucille Ball experienced during her early years. A world that suddenly became chaotic, a child unable to control what was happening around her. And sometimes, it is precisely those kinds of early years that create a personality trait that lasts a lifetime. In Lucille Ball's case, many believe it created a powerful need, the need to control everything around her, a need that years later, Hollywood would soon come to recognize. In her late teenage years, Lucille Ball left her small town in New York and moved to New York City with a very familiar dream: to become an actress. Like thousands of young people who poured into the city each year, she enrolled at the John Murray Anderson School of Dramatic Arts, one of the most prestigious theater schools of its time. There, Lucille Ball studied alongside many ambitious students. One of them would later become a Hollywood legend, Bette Davis. But while some students were encouraged to pursue the stage, Lucille Ball received very different feedback. One teacher told her bluntly, "You don't have star quality. Too clumsy, not elegant enough, not the look of a movie star." In Hollywood during the 1930s, that was almost a sentence, ending a career before it had even begun. After leaving school, Lucille Ball began searching for work in the entertainment industry. But the road was far from easy. She appeared in extremely small roles. Sometimes she was just a woman, standing in the background of a scene, a nameless character, a face the audience would not even remember. For many years, her career seemed completely stalled. And there were moments when Lucille Ball could barely afford to eat. Hollywood was full of beautiful women, elegant actresses with perfect smiles and graceful presence. In a world like that, Lucille Ball understood that she could hardly compete through beauty alone. But during those years of failure, she realized something very few people noticed. Hollywood had hundreds of beautiful women, but almost none of them were willing to make themselves look foolish in front of the camera. And Lucille Ball began experimenting with exactly that. At first, it was only small gestures, an exaggerated facial expression, a clumsy movement, a comedic situation pushed slightly too far. But gradually, she discovered something important. Every time she was willing to break the graceful image expected of a female actress, the audience laughed even harder. A completely different path was beginning to open, a path that very few people in Hollywood at that time dared to walk. And Lucille Ball began stepping onto that path, even though she still had no idea that this very choice would eventually change the history of American television. In the early 1940s, when her career was still searching for a clear direction, Lucille Ball's life took an unexpected turn. A turn no one could have predicted. In 1940, on the set of the film Too Many Girls, she met the man who would completely change her life. Desi Arnaz. Desi Arnaz was a Cuban musician with an energy entirely different from the world of Hollywood at that time. He was charming, impulsive, full of stage charisma. And for Lucille Ball, who had spent years trying to find her place in the entertainment industry, Desi brought a kind of energy that was almost impossible to resist. The two fell in love quickly. Just a few months after meeting, they decided to get married. But from the very beginning, their marriage carried storms within it. Desi Arnaz was constantly touring with his band, trips that lasted weeks, sometimes months. And his growing fame also came with habits that Hollywood of that era knew all too well: alcohol, late-night parties, and rumors of relationships outside the marriage. Friends later recalled that Lucille and Desi could argue fiercely, explosive fights, moments of separation, then finding their way back to each other again. But that very chaotic relationship unintentionally sparked an idea that no one at the time realized would change television forever. A comedy show centered on the life of a married couple constantly caught in troublesome situations, a wife with big ambitions always trying to break into show business, a hot-tempered husband who nevertheless loves his wife, a marriage filled with misunderstandings, arguments, and laughter. By 1951, the idea of a comedy show centered around the married life of Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz finally became reality. The show carried a very simple name: I Love Lucy. At first, not everyone believed the program would succeed. Television was still a very new medium at the time. Many producers were even worried that American audiences would not accept an interracial couple on screen, a white American woman and a Cuban man. But Lucille Ball and Desi Arnaz were determined, and they wanted audiences to see their real marriage, with all its chaos, misunderstandings, and awkwardly funny moments. And when the show finally aired, something almost unprecedented in television history began to happen. Audiences didn't just watch the show, they waited for it every single week. In I Love Lucy, Lucille Ball was not the perfect wife typically portrayed on television at that time. Instead, she was willing to do things very few Hollywood actresses dared to do. She stomped grapes inside a wine vat at a winery. She tried to stuff dozens of chocolates into her mouth when a factory conveyor belt began moving too fast. and she constantly came up with bizarre plans that sent everything spiraling into chaos. Lucille Ball was not afraid to look foolish. Now, she was not afraid to break the elegant image that Hollywood often imposed on women. In an era when actresses were expected to always be graceful, perfect, and in control of their emotions, Lucille Ball showed audiences something entirely different. Women could also be clumsy. They could be ambitious. They could be impulsive, and still be incredibly funny. But the most revolutionary moment of the show came from something very ordinary. When Lucille Ball became pregnant in real life, the producers faced a difficult decision. American television at the time even avoided using the word pregnant on air. Most shows used softer phrases like expecting or with child. But I Love Lucy did something no television program had done before. They wrote Lucy's pregnancy directly into the storyline of the show. And when the episode featuring Lucy giving birth aired, it became one of the most watched television broadcasts of its era. Millions of American families sat in front of their screens, laughing together, waiting together. In that moment, I Love Lucy was no longer just a comedy show. It had become a part of American life. But what audiences saw on screen did not always reflect the full story behind the camera. Because while millions of viewers were laughing in front of their televisions each week, inside the studio of I Love Lucy, things were sometimes very different. On television, Lucille Ball was the clumsy woman who made audiences burst into laughter. But on the set of I Love Lucy, many people remembered her in a very different way. Lucille Ball was famous for being an extreme perfectionist. She paid attention to every tiny detail. If a scene did not land with the right comedic timing, she could demand it be filmed again. If an actor stood in the wrong camera position, she could stop the scene immediately. For Lucille Ball, comedy was not simply improvisation. It was a precise mechanism where every movement, every facial expression, every pause had to occur at exactly the right moment. Some actors who worked with her said that this made her a very difficult person to work with. Others believed that this very strictness was what allowed the show to reach the level of perfection audiences saw on screen. But that was not the only controversy surrounding Lucille Ball. In the 1950s, as America was experiencing a powerful wave of anti-communist investigations, her name suddenly appeared in a political inquiry. Records from the Federal Bureau of Investigation revealed that Lucille Ball had once registered as having a connection to the Communist Party, USA, in the late 1930s. In the atmosphere of McCarthyism, accusations like that could destroy the career of almost any star. Lucille Ball later explained that the registration had been done simply to please her grandfather, who held very strong political views. In the end, the incident did not end her career, but it revealed something very clear. Behind the cheerful image of Lucy Ricardo on screen, there was a far more complex person. A woman living in a world where fame, power, and controversy often existed side by side. After all the success, the controversies, and the stories behind the scenes, Lucille Ball's image has always contained something difficult to explain. On screen, she was the symbol of laughter. A woman who could make an entire room burst into laughter with nothing more than a single facial expression. But behind the scenes, many people remembered her as someone extremely strict. A perfectionist, someone who controlled every tiny detail. And that contrast made many people wonder, who was the real Lucille Ball? Perhaps the answer lies within the very paradox of her life. The woman who made the entire nation laugh every week was also someone who constantly carried a fear of being replaced. Her childhood began with loss. Her father died when she was still very young. Her family life was constantly changing. There was no sense of stability. Then came the years of struggle in Hollywood, when she repeatedly heard that she did not have star quality. Even after she became famous, Lucille Ball still had to live inside a ruthless industry, one where new faces constantly appeared and old stars could be forgotten very quickly. In a world like that, control becomes a form of protection. Control the camera, control the script, control the rhythm of the punchline, control every detail of the show. So not because Lucille Ball wanted to become a frightening person, but because she understood something that very few people say openly about Hollywood. If you lose control, this industry will find someone else to replace you. When Lucille Ball passed away on April 27, 1989, at the age of 77, American television did not simply lose a famous actress. It lost one of the figures who helped shape the very way modern television operates. In the memories of many viewers, Lucille Ball will always be connected to the image of Lucy Ricardo in I Love Lucy, the clumsy wife who constantly found herself in absurd situations. The woman who could make an entire room laugh with nothing more than a glance or an exaggerated expression. But when one looks back at the history of American television, her influence went far beyond laughter. Lucille Ball changed the way television shows were created, produced, and even the way audiences experienced them. After the enormous success of I Love Lucy, she and Desi Arnaz built Desilu Productions, a production company that initially existed only to serve their show, but soon grew into one of the most important television studios in Hollywood. When Lucille Ball took control of Desilu in the early 1960s, she stepped into a position that very few women had ever reached in the entertainment industry, leading a major studio and directly deciding which programs would appear on the screens of millions of American households. At that time, television was still largely an industry controlled by men, so the fact that a female comedy actress became the head of a studio was not just a personal success, it opened a new precedent for women in Hollywood. It was at Desilu that Lucille Ball made decisions that would later be seen as turning points in popular culture. Among them was her support for producing television series that many other producers considered far too risky, such as Star Trek and Mission Impossible. Those programs would go on not only to succeed on television, but to become cultural franchises that endured for generations. But perhaps Lucille Ball's greatest legacy lies in something far simpler. Before the era of I Love Lucy, women on television were often written into very limited roles. Gentle, elegant, and rarely the center of comedy. Lucille Ball broke that pattern. The character Lucy Ricardo could make mistakes, create chaos, and even look completely ridiculous, yet it was precisely that chaos that made the character feel more relatable and authentic to audiences. In doing so, Lucille Ball did more than make people laugh. She changed the way women could be seen on screen. And so, when people look back at Lucille Ball's career today, they remember more than the iconic comedic scenes or the roar of laughter from studio audiences. So they remember a woman who entered a ruthless industry, learned how to control it, and ultimately left a mark so profound that decades after her passing, her influence still echoes in the very way television is created and stories are told. When looking back at the life of Lucille Ball, it becomes clear that her story contains a very unusual paradox. The woman who made millions of viewers laugh in front of their television screens every week was also someone who spent nearly her entire life fighting to be taken seriously within her own industry. She did not enter Hollywood with advantages. She was not the most striking beauty. She was not the person anyone predicted would become a major star. Yet through persistence, ambition, And a completely unique style of comedy, Lucille Ball transformed the way television was created. From an actress once told she had no star quality, she became the most powerful woman on American television. Perhaps that is the true paradox of fame. The people who make us laugh the most are sometimes the ones who understand sadness the most deeply. And perhaps that is why, decades after I Love Lucy left the air, the laughter of Lucille Ball still echoes. Not merely as comedy, but as the mark of a woman who changed the history of television. And finally, if this story reminds you of a favorite comedic moment from Lucille Ball, share that moment in the comments below. And if you would like to discover more stories behind other Hollywood legends, be sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos.